Hey there, it's Melissa Brunetti, and welcome to the Mind Your Own Karma podcast.
Hey there, Karma crew. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Mind Your Own Karma, the Adoption Chronicles. Today I have Elizabeth Barbour on the show. Elizabeth is both a reunited adoptee and adoptive mother. Since 2000, she has coached thousands of women to find their way back to solid ground when life gets chaotic and overwhelming. Elizabeth intimately understands the twists and turns of life's transitions, having weathered the pain of divorce, the death of her parents, emotional struggles surrounding adoption, the heartache of miscarriage and fertility issues, complex family relationships, and a near-fatal car accident. Elizabeth guides women through a self-care and ritual process where grief and gratitude can live side by side through her coaching program, Solid Ground, Navigating Transitions when it's all just too much. A firm believer in the power of community, she guides her clients to create connections so they aren't left to carry the weight of their grief alone. As a life coach and shamanic practitioner, she brings a unique blend of traditional coaching techniques and ancient wisdom to her practice. Elizabeth is the author of 2 books, Smart Self-Care for Busy Women and Sacred Celebrations, Designing Rituals to Navigate Life's Milestone Transitions. She's working on her 3rd book about adoption reunions currently. Here is my interview with Elizabeth Barbour. We have Elizabeth Barbour here today. Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi, Melissa.
So let's jump right in. I want to know what you know about the circumstances of your adoption.
So I was born in 1970, and I was placed for adoption with my adoptive parents at about 2 weeks old. And I was raised as an only child by my mom and dad. They had had infertility issues, and so that's why they adopted me. My birth mom I think she had just turned 19 when she gave birth to me. And that was back in 1970. And being an unwed mom was a really hard path. And so her mom encouraged her to place me for adoption. And so that was what happened. Turns out my birth dad, who I'm in reunion with, and he lived just up the hill on the neighboring farm. So they had grown up and gone to high school together and had known each other pretty much their whole lives. So,
wow. So can you share with us your earliest memories of understanding you were adopted? Were you told early, and what were you thinking?
I do not remember a time when I didn't know that I was adopted. My parents did a really good job of always talking openly about it, always talking very positively about it, talking very lovingly about my birth mom and her decision. So I'll be honest, I don't even have a memory of a specific time I was told. It was just kind of always something I knew.
Yeah, that is key, I think. A huge
Yeah.
key to. So did you feel like you were able to discuss anything, any curiosities that you had about being adopted?
I did. My mom actually, my adoptive mom grew up in an orphanage. Her parents had died when she was really young. And so she was one of 8 children, and they were all placed in an orphanage.
Mm.
And 7 out of the 8 were actually placed in homes. My mother was placed in a home with a prominent dentist in town. This is back in the early 1940s. And the dad was abusive to her. And so she called the orphanage and said, "Take me back." And, back in the 1940s, they thought she was ridiculous and ungrateful. How can you do this? This is this wealthy dentist. But my mom, at 10 years old, had integrity and knew her worth and knew that she couldn't stay in that situation. So she stayed in the orphanage until she was 18, and then left and walked down the street and got a room at the YWCA and got a job and, got on with her life. I mean, she has a remarkable story. So
Yeah.
because of her desire to be connected with her birth family, and she did eventually reconnect with her siblings over the years, she was really open with me about my needs and my desires to ask questions and be curious and know about my biological family. So she created that safe space for me.
Yeah, that's great. How has your perspective changed over the years and evolved about adoption?
Wow, that's a big question, Melissa.
I know.
In a couple ways. The first is because not only am I now an adult adoptee in reunion, celebrated 25 years this year in reunion with my biological family, but I'm also an adoptive mother of a 13-year-old daughter. And we've been living in reunion with some of her biological family. So I now see two different sides of the equation. And I mean, I knew there was grief as an adoptee, and then I've experienced grief as an adoptive mother. And so I now understand that the whole system itself of adoption is so imperfect. And it is built on a system of secrecy and lies and incompletion and loss and trauma. And so, as much as there have been really good things for it in my own life, loving parents and being able to be a parent to an incredible kid, it's been really filled with heartache and loss. And so I think my perspective has changed in that I'm more aware and have a bigger picture understanding of the complexities of all of it.
Yeah. So it sounds like a lot of that was, what we call coming out of the fog. When do you think you kind of did that? Was there a catalyst?
Yeah, I would probably say my reunion, and particularly maybe even before I met my first family member, even the search, because I did a search back in the mid to late 90s and was involved in some search organizations and talked with some other adoptees who were going through it. And it really stirred up a lot of stuff for me and had me asking a lot of questions that I really hadn't as a young person, as a teenager. And so I think that was probably the first time I started looking at it. And then when I met my birth family, you kind of go through the honeymoon period, or at least I did, because I've had a really positive reunion. But then you start running up against roadblocks and emotional stuff, and you're like, wait a minute, where's this coming from? So it's just so nuanced and complex and layered.
Yeah. How has being an adoptee shaped your identity and your sense of self?
I spent so many years not feeling like I belonged anywhere.
Mm.
And I know I'm not alone. All the adoptees that I've talked with, worked with, friends with, colleagues, you kind of feel like well, I won't speak for you or anybody else. I'll speak for myself. I always felt like I was different, like I was other, almost even alien at times. Like, who are these people? And I remember my mom used to say things to me like, I just don't understand you, child. I just don't understand you. And now you might say that to a biological kid too, right? But
Yeah.
as an adopted kid, I heard that, and what my interpretation was, I'm different than you.
Mm-hmm.
And that's bad. So yeah, I mean, I think from identity as a young person, I really struggled with that for years. And I remember when I met my birth mom, I was 29 when I met her for the first time. And I just started to feel a sense of being whole and complete in a way that I'd never felt before. It was the way I describe it is like I found puzzle pieces that I didn't even know were missing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it took many years for them to integrate. I've been in reunion 25 years now, and I think they're all finally in place, but
you never know.
I know. I still find a random piece. I'm like, oh, there's this piece.
I know. Just when you think the puzzle's done, right? I always say it's kind of like a puzzle that doesn't have the edge pieces, there's no boundary. There's no, it just you keep adding more pieces, adding more pieces.
That's a great description. I love that.
Yeah. What motivated you to become an adoptive parent?
A 5.5 year infertility journey.
Mm-hmm. Did being an adoptee like affect your decision at all? Did you like double, kind of second guess? And
so it affected it in two ways. It was always an option. Adoption was always an option to create our family because of my adoption, my positive reunion. So it was always on the table. It was always something that we discussed. But also the fact that I grew up adopted and didn't know anybody that was biologically related to me until I was 29, had a very strong drive to have a biological child and to live in the same house as someone who was biologically related to me. And when I found my birth family, I found 11 half brothers and sisters.
Oh my goodness.
So my birth mom raised 3 children and my birth dad raised 8 children. And so I assumed, oh, I've got really good fertility genes. Like it's going to be no problem for me to have a baby. And that was not our path. And so, yeah, so it was a little bit of both. You know, I was very committed for a long time. And then once we finally got off the drugs and the surgery and the IVF and, you know, the really tough stuff and made the decision to adopt, our daughter was born within 4 months.
Wow. So adopted as an infant.
Yeah.
Okay. So
Yes.
how did your experience as an adoptee influence your approach to adopting a child? That maybe somebody that's not adopted, you know, do you think yours was different?
I think mine was different. It's funny, I'm getting emotional thinking about it. I give my mom, Joan, my adoptive mom, a lot of credit. Because and goodness knows she was a very, very challenging mother. we struggled pretty much our whole relationship. And one of the things that she did really, really right was about being open, about being loving, about being inclusive. She was thrilled when I found my birth mom. In fact, I remember when I went and I decided I was going to search. I was 25 at the time. And I said, Mom, you know, I've been thinking about this thing and it's been on my heart and I want your blessing. And she said, I've been wondering when you were going to get around to this. Of course, I'll help you. So she was very loving and supportive. And so in that regard, I have always just felt the same way about our daughter's birth mother and then now her birth dad, who we are in reunion with, but have just always had the utmost respect and love and appreciation and gratitude for the really difficult decision that she had to make in placing our daughter for adoption. And we've just always been really open. You know, I invite my daughter to ask questions, and we read lots of books when she was a little girl. Oh, I actually have I have a really interesting story to tell you if you'd like to hear it.
Yeah.
So when she was about 5, she asked me, my daughter's name is Riley, and she asked me, she said, Mommy, were you ever pregnant? And I thought, oh my gosh, a 5-year-old? Why is she asking me this? But then I realized it was one of the women in my neighborhood was pregnant. So it was really her first experience of seeing somebody with a big belly and, oh, she's pregnant. What is that? So she said, so Mommy, you know, were you ever pregnant? And so I decided to be honest with her. And I said, yes. And she said, well, what happened? And I said, well, the babies died. And she said, babies? There was more than one? And I said, yes, I was pregnant with twins. And she said, oh, Mommy, that's so sad. She said, well, do you think that when the babies die, that their soul goes to heaven? And I said, yes, you know, I do believe that. I said, of course, we don't know, but that is my belief. And she said, well, do you think when they go to heaven, they find another mommy's tummy so that they can come back? And I was just so blown away by this conversation. I said, well, I've never really thought about that. But yeah, I suppose if their little soul really wanted to come to earth, yeah, I suppose they would do that. Yeah. So that makes a lot of sense. So yeah, I think so. And she just got really quiet. And she said, that's what happened to me. I was in your tummy. I went to heaven. And then I went into my birth mom's tummy so I could find my way to you.
Oh my gosh. What did you say?
I cried. I think I was speechless for quite a while. And then what's really amazing, Melissa, she told me the exact same story about 2 years later when she was about 7.
Wow.
And now that she's 13, she has no recollection of that.
Yeah.
But of course, I wrote it all down.
Yeah. Wow.
But she was very insistent that that's what happened. So okay.
At 5 years old. That's so crazy. What an enlightened little girl.
I know. I know.
Cool. So, being adopted, do you think that affected your parenting style, raising your daughter?
Yes.
In what ways?
I was raised by parents who always wanted to mold me into who they were. Do it this way, do it that way. This is the right way. This is the wrong way. And Riley's dad and I have been very clear that she is perfect as a child of God and as the little being that she was meant to be. And that our job is to keep her safe, to, steer her in the right direction, hopefully give her good values and morals and good experiences, but let her be who she's going to be. And that's very different than how I was parented. I was parented in a very, very strict and controlling manner. And while I still think we have some good boundaries, I mean, she's in middle school and still doesn't have a phone, which, we hear about all the time.
I'm
Like,
sure.
I'm the only one who doesn't have a phone. I'm like, yeah, well, you'll get one eventually, but I'm not ready yet. But overall, we just kind of let her be who she's going to be. And it's wonderful to witness, actually. It's very different than her dad and I. Very different.
Yeah.
But she's a marvel.
Did you have a open or closed adoption? And being an adoptee, did that affect which way you went with that?
So my adoption was closed. And then adopting her was open.
Okay. Is that still working well then?
Yeah. So her birth mom kept in touch with us for the first 2 years, and mostly through texts and some photos exchanged. And then when Riley was about 2 years old, we stopped hearing from her birth mom, which was really disappointing to me because we had always said, we'd love for you to be part of her life if you'd like to. We'll totally leave it up to you. And we really thought there was going to be a relationship. But for whatever reason, maybe it's too painful for her, not sure.
Yeah.
She stopped contact. So I do still text her every year on our daughter's birthday. And I just send her updates and I send her photos and I just say she's thriving and she asks about you. And when you're ready, we're here. Like,
Yeah.
no pressure. But the invitation is always here. And so that's her situation. Her birth dad's a little different because he didn't know that he had fathered a child. And we found him, or I should say his mother, Riley's grandmother, found us through ancestry.com.
Wow. So was that a total
And
surprise? Like, did they totally not know anything until then?
they did
Wow.
not know. They did not know. And the way that happened was it was Christmas of 2019, and I had given ancestry kits to each of the three of us, Eric and Riley and I thought, oh, this will be fun. Let's just kind of do our genetics and see what it is. Because obviously all three of us were going to be different. And so when we got Riley's back, I saw that she was 50% Caucasian and then 13% Mexican and 13% Japanese. And we're like, oh, that's really cool. That's really interesting. So I start digging in to the ancestry and we get to this section and it says 100% paternal match. And it had someone's name that was different than what we thought it was. And we were like, wait, what? So we figured it out a couple months before his family did. And we just decided to sit on the information because we didn't really know what to do with it. We were like, this is not what we were expecting at all. And about 4 months later, I got contacted by his grandmother, who was just lovely. And she said, hi, we see that I think in Ancestry, minors are in just by their initials. It says, oh, I see that R is part of our family tree. Can you help me understand that? And I remember calling Eric into my office and I was like, here we go. Are you ready? Like, here we go. And so, I wrote her back and I said, your son is our daughter's father. And within not even 24 hours, we were on the phone with him. I mean, he called and he was so excited. He was thrilled. And, since then we talk to him weekly. We've probably had a dozen visits in the last 4 years. He and his wife just had a new baby. And so our daughter has a half brother. And so we went and met him, and it's thrilling. It's wonderful. He's been very loving, very open, and Riley just adores him. And my goodness, does she look like him? So it's fun for her. It's so fun.
What's his name on the birth certificate? Or was there a dad on the birth certificate?
Well, a lot of states have amended birth certificates. So there was not a name on the birth certificate, but we were told that it was somebody else that it turned out not to be.
Okay. So going through the adoption process, what improvements did you kind of observe that might need to happen in the industry?
Oh my gosh. I'll be honest. I'm not sure I have a great answer for that, Melissa, because our adoption with her was so unusual. It happened in like 36 hours. It ended up being a private adoption, not through an agency. And it was such a whirlwind. And it all happened so quickly. It was just like, we get a call Saturday morning at 4 a.m. There's a baby. And by Sunday at 4 p.m., we're checking it in the hospital and we bring her home the next day. Like,
oh my gosh.
It happened so quickly. So I would honestly have to think about that question a little bit more before I could give you a really good answer to that.
Okay. What advice would you give to adoptive parents to support their adoptive children better?
I would say openness is the number one thing. Openness, honesty, transparency, authenticity. I talk to a lot of people and they'll say, oh, I know this really difficult thing about my child's biological family or whatever. I'm not going to tell them. I'm going to keep it from them. And it's been my experience that the truth always has a way of revealing itself.
Yeah.
And so the sooner, and of course it always has to be age appropriate, right? Like you're not going to tell your 3-year-old really difficult things. Right. But in age appropriate ways, when we tell our children honestly about their origins and where they come from, it's empowering for them that they get to digest and accept and assimilate that information. It's just like talking to them about anything, really. You gave it to them in an age appropriate way. And then if they have more questions, they'll come back.
Yeah.
And you talk about it there. But I think openness and honesty is probably the biggest thing.
Yeah. I think that's one of the big stumbling block with adoptive parents is when they're trying to protect, and that's not necessarily the best thing. Like you said, age appropriate, but I think from what I've heard from, the majority of adoptees, they still want to know the hard things. They still want to know who they are, whether it's good, bad, or ugly. And so I think that's important for adoptive parents to know that it is still important for that the truth comes out, even if it does hurt a little bit, just to be there for those kids in whatever way possible. But like you said, the truth comes out. So you don't want to be that person that withheld that, and then it affects your relationship down the road.
Right. A question you asked me earlier made me think about this. I remember when I was in high school, I worked at a jewelry store in my hometown. I was raised in Connecticut, and I was working with a jeweler who was a 26-year-old young woman, really gifted, talented craftsman. And she found out from her parents at age 26 that she was adopted. And she was filled with rage. And, I was like 16, I was a good decade younger, but I had always known. And so, at first I was kind of like, well, what's the big deal? You're adopted. And then I was like, oh, wait, but she never knew. So she lived a lie for 26 years versus me, who always knew that, oh yeah, mom and dad adopted.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, I've thought about her a lot.
I don't know how I would handle that. Well, I know how I would handle it. And thank God that's not my story, because I would be furious. I would be furious. Pre-verbal trauma can leave deep scars, but healing is possible. Somatic Mindful Guided Imagery offers a path to recovery and inner peace. Reclaim your sense of self and find lasting comfort. Visit somatichealingjourneys.com today and start your gentle journey to healing. So you are working on a book about reunion. So let's talk about that a little bit. And you have a lot of experience with reunions, your own and also with your daughter. So can you share
Yes.
your experience with us a little bit?
Sure. Um, yeah, so maybe start by telling you a little bit about my reunion. So I was 29 when I found my biological family. Um, that was back in the 90s when we didn't really have the internet back then.
Yeah.
I think you started in the 90s as
Hmm.
well too.
Hmm.
Um, so it took me about 3.5 years, and I finally hired a private investigator who found my birth mom in 48 hours.
Wow.
And she called me. She said, "Okay, I've got her name and number." And I was like, "What? Wait, what? I haven't even like sent you a check yet." Which is like that in and of itself, like is ridiculous, right? That I had to pay somebody to help me find my birth mom like that. That's a whole nother podcast.
Yep.
That's a whole nother
Yep. Yep.
conversation. But so I got her name and number, and I was married to my first husband at the time, my high school sweetheart, and called him and got home from lunch, and he said, "Well, what are you going to do?" And I said, "Oh, well, I'll probably write her a letter this weekend." And he said, "Why don't you just call her right now?" And I kind of like, I finished my lunch. I got up, I went into the restroom, I brushed my teeth, I combed my hair, I got a little, pad and pen, and I sat down at the phone and I picked up the phone and I called her.
Wow.
And I'll never forget it because, I called and I asked for her name. I said, "Hi, I'm looking for Kathy Walker." And she said, "This is me. How can I help you?" And at the time, my married name was Becker. I had taken my first husband's name, so I was Elizabeth Becker. I said, "Well, hi, I'm Elizabeth Becker, and I'm doing some research on my family history, and I live in North Carolina. Can you chat with me for a few minutes?" Come to find out, half of her family is German, and she's got Beckers in her family history. So she just assumed I was a long lost cousin.
Oh my
So
gosh.
she said, "Yeah, sure. What can I do for you? How can I help?" And I said, "Well, I was born, you know, January 10th, 1970, told at the hospital." And I said, "I think I'm your daughter." And there was just total silence on the other end of the line. And she didn't talk. I had to speak again. And I said, "Did you give birth to a baby girl on that day?" And she said, "Yes, I did. I've hoped and prayed that this day would come."
Wow.
And it was amazing. So, that quickly led to, I said, "Are you married? Does he know about me?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Great." Because I wanted her to have support. And I said, "Do you have siblings?" And she said, "Yeah." I said, "Do you have children?" She said, "Yes. I have three." And I was like, "Oh my gosh, I have siblings. This is so exciting." Because I was raised as an only child.
Right.
And so our first phone call was just about 20 minutes. Then we talked again that night for about 2 hours. And we arranged to meet in 2 weeks after that. Actually, I drove from North Carolina to Florida to meet her. And what was so interesting to find out was that she only lived an hour from my mom. And so, even though I didn't grow up in Florida, I was raised in Connecticut. When my dad passed away, about 5 years before I met Kathy, my mom moved to Florida and was only an hour away from my birth mom. So all
Wow.
those years I had been visiting, and I actually had grandparents in that area, sort of Tampa Bay, Clearwater, Bradenton, that whole area.
Wow.
Um, so yeah, so this is an important point that I wanted to make sure that I shared too, because I think when people are entering reunion, it's so important to be very intentional about how you create your first meetings.
Mm.
So we were very, very intentional. Like we talked about what do we want? What do you need? What do I need? What is going to be comfortable for everybody? We chose a neutral location to meet because Kathy's my birth mom, didn't want to be necessarily her turf, but not necessarily my turf either, which would have been with my adoptive mom. Her name was Joan. And so we chose a hotel. We chose to meet at the Vinoy Hotel in St. Petersburg, which is this big, beautiful grand resort. And they have a beautiful covered front porch. And we thought, that's kind of a nice neutral place to meet. And so what we decided to do was that first day, we just met the two of us and just for about 4 hours. So we kept it very contained. We said, let's meet, let's have lunch, let's walk around, and then let's take some space. And so that was really good, I think, for both of us. And then the next day, I brought my then husband and we went to her home which was about an hour away. And then I met her husband and her 3 children, my siblings. And again, we kept it contained. It was about a 4-hour period.
How did you know to do that?
So,
I mean,
I think because my emotions were so strong and, I mean, I don't know, maybe it was my training. I have a master's in counseling and so had been doing some work in that field for a while. Although I was mostly working in higher ed at the time, but I had that training and understanding that, when you're in a highly charged emotional situation, you need to, move slowly, be intentional, be mindful, take pauses, take breaks, and give yourself space. I think it worked really well for us. Worked really well for us.
Sounds like it. So what other secrets do you have for us to make reunions successful? You've had a long-term successful reunion. So what advice do you have for those thinking about going in or maybe already in and it's difficult?
I think one of the most important things to do is get help fast. Pull in, your closest family and friends, make sure that they are on board, that they're supporting you, that they're loving you through it. If you don't have a therapist or a coach or a body worker or a healer, whoever it is that's in your sort of self-care team, make sure you line that up. As you and I know, we met through the Adoption Professional Network, that Beth Syverson has really pulled together. So, calling on people who have experience with that. Also, there's now Facebook groups, there's search and support groups. So there's a lot of support in place that you and I didn't have back in the 90s when we were initially searching.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, as I've been writing this book and I've been interviewing people, even people who've just been reunited in the last 3 to 5 years, they don't even know about the support that's out there.
Wow.
I was talking to one 79-year-old birth mom just 3 or 4 days ago. And I said, do you know anybody else like you? Do you know another birth mom who's reunited with her child? And she said, no, I don't know anybody like me.
Oh my goodness.
I thought, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
So I shared some resources with her, but so I think getting help and getting support is really one of the biggest things. I think the other thing I would say is to just be aware of how complex it is. It might be initially exciting, especially if you have 2 parties who are excited about reunion. That's not always the case, as you know. Sometimes one party is excited and the other is hesitant or resistant or isn't willing at all.
Yeah.
So I think an important aspect of just being open to whatever's going to happen and know that it's not about you. And I think, you and I had talked a little bit about that when I interviewed you for my book.
Yeah.
And, you talked about not taking things personally and that everyone has their own personal journey.
Yeah.
And it's usually not about you. Their response and their reaction isn't about you.
Yeah. I would say expectations are huge too. Having expectations going in can not only disappoint you, but be a precursor to it not going well, So like you said, just kind of be open to the process and allowing that space for everyone to be who they are. And then, looking at that and drawing boundaries from there if you need to,
Yes.
Once you find out, some things about that person, then how do you feel about that? Just check in with yourself, give yourself that space to explore how you're feeling. A lot, like you said, a lot of us just kind of rush in and expect it just to, all the pieces to fit and it's going to be great. And, but yeah, it doesn't always go that way. And, the honeymoon period sometimes is great. And then, those pieces aren't fitting quite right. And then there can be some complications. So I always think expectations, try not to go in with those as much as possible, but also honor yourself and your boundaries as well.
I agree with that. And of course, communication is really critical, but specifically within that, asking clarifying questions. If somebody says something or does something that triggers you, say, can we talk about this? Here's my understanding of what you said or what you experienced. but can you help me understand your perspective on that?
Yeah.
Because I think so often we just misunderstand something. And then if we don't talk about it, then things get blown out of proportion. And then that causes real conflict,
Yeah.
which could have been avoided if we had just asked those clarifying questions in the beginning. Like, help me understand this.
Yeah. I think we go into it thinking because they're biologically, related to us, that it should be easy, that it should just feel easy and nice and perfect and all those things. And it probably rarely is perfect. And, no relation's perfect. So,
Well, exactly. And, we're all human and everybody's coming to the table with their own baggage and their own life experience and their own perspectives. And when you don't grow up with your biological family, you're going to be coming at it from a very different place. One other thing I wanted to add, Melissa, to your question earlier about advice about people in reunion is if you're supporting a child who is going through reunion, like in our case, I mean, we were very surprised to be in reunion when our daughter was 9. And
yeah.
that was not in the playbook.
Right.
I think a really important thing to remember there, as well as the intentionality and building in space and all of that, but is to pace it appropriately for the child. We didn't talk to our daughter's birth dad and then go fly to meet him, the same weekend.
Yeah.
We started with a phone call and then we started with some emails and then with some letters and let's exchange some photos and let's do another Zoom call. And then eventually we worked our way up to a visit, which was several months down the road, but we really paced it for her based on what she wanted. And we would ask her, say, what do you want and need now? Does this feel good to you? Do you want to do this? And we always let her set the tone for that. And I think that was really important, not just as her parents, because of course we wanted to protect her, but not always making decisions for her, but saying, what would you like here? And then on the flip side of that, also making sure that we do protect her. So it wasn't until her 13th birthday that we gave her direct access to her birth dad. So for the first 4 years of reunion, every contact she had with him, either her dad or I, was either on the call or in the room or present with him, just because she's little. And then when she turned 13, we made a conscious decision. Her dad and I sat and talked and we said, okay, we feel like, we love Matt and we're in a great relationship with him. We think she's old enough to have this responsibility. And when I told her the news, she said, Mom, it's the best birthday gift you could ever give me. And so now she and her birth dad, they text, they email each other. And, she really loves having that connection with him. But I'm glad we waited. I'm glad we didn't do it too early.
Yeah. I'm sure you have to look at their maturity level and their emotional, how they are emotionally and kind of gauge that. But I do feel that's important to, even though they're that young, to kind of include them in some of the conversations. And how will you know how they're feeling unless you ask,
Right.
So that's super important. So what inspired you to write this book about reunions and how do you hope that it helps the community?
Well, I think I knew I would write it from day one. It just took me 25 years to get around to it.
It's needed. It's badly needed.
Well, I think it is, as I've been doing the lit review. There isn't an updated book that's been written about adoption reunions specifically in almost a decade.
I bet.
So it's time to sort of update some of the literature. There's some wonderful classic books out there, books that I used during my reunion, 25 years ago. But I think we need a little bit of update and we need more stories as society has changed, as our access to technology has changed, as 23andMe and Ancestry has changed reunion. There's a lot that's different. So I think I want to address a lot of that. But I think what I realized is, my birth mom died last year unexpectedly. She was very young, only 72. She had COVID and pneumonia and died very quickly. And I thought I'd have another 20 years.
Yeah.
At least 10.
Yeah.
And so, but what I realized is, oh my gosh, I had 24 with her that a lot of adoptees never get. And as I've been interviewing people for my book, I've been interviewing adoptees, adoptive parents, and biological parents. And I met with one adoptee, a 70-year-old physician And when he found his biological family, his parents had passed on. So he found some siblings, but he said, I wish I had searched sooner. I wish I had more time. And so I think my hope and my intention with this book is to, give people some tools for not only, I'm not going to really focus on search as much as how to build a happy, healthy, long-term relationship in reunion. Just like any relationship in your life, whether it's parenting or marriage or friendship or employee relations or whatever it is, it takes intention. It takes good communication. It takes work. It takes visioning. What's our vision for this? What do we want? I remember in my very first conversation with my birth dad, he said, I don't know what you want. And I said, I don't know either, but let's figure it out.
Yeah.
One conversation, one step at a time. And there was a time, it was maybe about a year into reunion, and we had a conversation. We said, oh, this is permanent. And we both agreed. We was like, yes, like this, we are going to stick around. So I want to give people the tools. I also really am hoping to share the stories of a wide variety of reunion, because I personally have had, I would say, a pretty fairy tale reunion. I mean, I've been to as many weddings and graduations and birthday parties as possible for my 11 siblings. And we try and visit each other. We live in different states. And so obviously I don't see them as much as I would like to. But I've had a really wonderful, loving, open reunion. But that is not everybody's story. I've talked to so many people who either were initially rejected, or maybe they initially had a positive experience and then it went sideways, or one person got really unhealthy and another person didn't have good boundaries, whatever. There's so many different iterations about it. So I really want to share all these different stories of different people and let people know that, as you've said, Melissa, it's like, don't have expectations, because you don't know what it's going to be. Show up, be honest, be authentic, be positive, be hopeful, and know that what's going to be is going to be.
Yeah.
And, you'll have to find your way through that.
Yeah. When you're talking about two people coming together that have been through trauma, and how that's affected them, and then kind of trying to navigate that can take so many left turns suddenly. And in my own case, and I've heard many other adoptees talking about how it came out of left field, the second rejection. It's like, what happened? I thought things were okay, at least okay. I didn't think they were horrible, like what happened?
Yeah.
And that's where the communication again comes in, because I feel like we don't feel like we can communicate. We can't ask those hard questions of these new people, that have come into our lives. So being open to feeling like you can communicate, but then also taking what comes, because they might not be willing to communicate back, So I would have like 1,000 chapters in this book, because it could go so many different directions. I don't envy you in trying to figure out how to put this all into a book.
Well, I will keep you posted.
Yes, I'm very excited to see how you do this.
Well, thank you. And, for sure, one thing I do want to add too, one thing I'll definitely be talking about is that, as there can be many positive aspects of reunion, new relationships, different sense of identity, different sense of self, there's all of that. The grief and trauma that we've talked about is very much a part of it. And actually, I've submitted a chapter in a book that's coming out in December. It's an anthology, and it's called The Faces of Grief. Mm-hmm. And I wrote about the grief inherent in the system of adoption, and talking about the grief from the biological parent standpoint, from the adoptive parent standpoint, or from the adoptee's standpoint as well. And so I think that chapter hopefully will be a good introduction to then what I'll be talking about in the book when it comes out. So we'll see. It is tentatively called Living in Reunion, and I'm hoping maybe to publish in 26-ish, if I can get it written in the next year and a half. That's my goal. So
okay. How do you think society's perception of adoption can be improved?
It is not a magical fairy tale that people say it is. I mean, I remember when Riley was an infant and I would be in the grocery store And it's obvious that she's not my biological child just by how we look. And people would ask questions, and then I would say, well, she's adopted. And they would say, oh, you're so wonderful. You've got such a great heart. And I was like, what? It's like, what are you talking about? I am the fortunate and privileged one here to be able to parent this precious being. But there is a woman out there who suffered so much pain and loss in her decision, knowing that she couldn't parent. And our society does not do a good job of supporting young mothers with their decisions. And so, I think that's the thing that I want people to understand. And I tell my story all the time to as many people as I can. Every time we haven't even talked about my profession, but I'm a coach and a speaker and an author. And I tell my story all the time because I want people to know that this is not always a happy-go-lucky story. Yes, my personal story has a really good ending, but it doesn't mean it wasn't without a lot of hardship and grief and loss and pain.
Yeah.
And I think we need to stop glorifying it as the answer. Just place the child for adoption. Everything will be okay.
Everything's great. Yeah, that fixes everything. So
yeah.
I was on your website, and I saw that you talk about sacred celebrations on there. What are sacred celebrations, and why do you think they're important?
Thank you. Yeah, so Sacred Celebrations is actually the book I just released this past November, and they're really rituals to help us navigate life's big transitions. So, well, that was the main focus of the book, is rituals to navigate life's big transitions. And we can have sacred celebrations every day. You can have a sacred celebration every morning when you drink your cup of tea or your cup of coffee, or when you say grace with your family at dinner at night. But sacred celebrations, to me, what I've been real passionate about over the last few years is about helping people know that when we're making a big life change, whether it's moving or starting a job, or a baby is being born, or someone's getting married, or someone has passed away, or someone's getting divorced, or in this case with adoption, you're adopting a child, or you're in reunion with a family member, those are all deserving of time and space and presence that are out of our ordinary reality.
Mm-hmm.
We live in such a busy world where we are fast-paced and on the go and all about achievement and what can I accomplish and what am I doing next? And we often forget to stop and savor those moments that are so very precious to us. So, in the book, in the Sacred Celebrations book, I write about for people impacted by adoption. I talk about reunions, like when Kathy and I were in reunion for 10 years, we did a trip together. And then our 20 years, we did a trip together, and just spent some time one-on-one, the two of us. And we had said we were going to do a 25-year one, and we didn't get that.
Yeah.
But for people who've adopted children, to celebrate their gotcha days, that phrase is really common in the adoption community, your gotcha day. When did your adoption become finalized? And telling stories, especially in my book, I share a couple of stories about people who adopted children internationally. And so what they do is on those anniversary of their special adoption day or their gotcha day, they recount stories of traveling overseas to, connect with their children and to bring them home. And they tell the special stories about that, and how they've incorporated that in the life of their family.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of in closing, what would you like struggling adoptive parents and adoptees to know?
I think they need to know they're not alone. This is a really complex, nuanced way of being in the world and way of being family to people. And you're not alone. There are other people out there. And to know that there are resources. There's people, there's books, there's groups and organizations that can help you walk through this journey. I'm always so amazed at the people who say, I don't know anybody like me. And I'm like, well, let's help you find them. I try and connect with them.
Yeah.
Resources. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, where can we find you and your books and all your other offerings? Tell us where to find you.
Well, the best place would be my website. So it's elizabethbarbour.com, and Barbour is spelled Barbour for people who are listening. I'm on social media. So I'm on Facebook as Elizabeth Barbour, on Instagram and on LinkedIn. So those are probably the 3 places I hang out. I also have a Facebook group for women particularly, but it's called Sacred Celebrations. And so that's kind of a fun, positive, uplifting group. And yeah, so that's where you can find me. And then I have a couple of offerings coming up in the fall. I have a retreat I'm hosting here in the beautiful mountains of Asheville, North Carolina in October.
Nice.
It's called the Magical Mountain Retreat, and it's for women in transition. And so that's in October. And then in September, I'll be starting a new coaching group called Solid Ground, and that's for people in life transition as well. So whether you're impacted by adoption or other life changes, or marriage, divorce, death of loved ones, moving, whatever, it's all welcome. So.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for everything that you're doing. I can't wait for this book to come out. And thank you for coming on the show today and sharing your story.
You're doing wonderful work, Melissa. Thank you so much for helping us all to share our stories and to learn from one another.
Thanks. Thank you, Karma Crew, for listening. And as always, take what you need and leave what you don't. And always remember to mind your own karma. And I'll see you next time.
This podcast is created for educational purposes by the telling of adoption experiences. The views expressed in this podcast may not be those of the host or Mind Your Own Karma.